Hello and welcome, guys, to session 6. So we're going to be looking at loops in general throughout session 6. And for this program in particular, we're going to be focusing on the for loop. Okay, so trying to understand how it is that it works. And loops in general are a very important part of programming because they allow us to give a singular instruction to the program and then having the program repeat that instruction as many times as we want it to. And then throughout, you can hold variables within that loop that hold, for example, the updated sum of a count as such. So I think the best way to understand loops is to actually look at a real example. So for this, we're going to look at a program that asks the user to enter a date. That date has to be starting from January 2001. And then based on that date, it calculates the day of the week and then it outputs it onto the screen. Okay, so let's dive deep and look into it. We're starting with our preprocessor, which is the IO stream, because again, we're dealing with that input output. Then we have our namespace declaration. We're going to be using the standard namespace. And then we have our main function. Okay, so good so far. This is all contained within our main function. Okay, and the first thing we want to do is collect that data from the user. So let's create some variables to do that. We have our day, month, year. That's going to be integer. And then we are going to output our message to ask for that day value. And then we're going to store that using the cin object. And then the extraction operator, we're going to store that into the day variable. We then go on to ask for the month and we ask for the year. So far, so good. You should be able to remember this bit about collecting data. We've done it a few times now. The interesting bit will come down here below when we start looking at loops for the first time. So we're going to be looping through the given years, months passed so far, and then turn those into days. And I'll show you how we can do that. So we need a variable to keep track of that day count. So we're going to add the number of days as we go through that year. Okay. So let's say we have here the day count variable, we set that to 0. And then we have our for loop. Now the for loop is defined by the for keyword. We then have the parameters of that for loop. You can think of it as the setting. So how often, how that loop is supposed to go and when it's supposed to stop. Then we have the body of the for loop, which is encapsulated within these brackets. Now, going back to kind of the setup of the loop itself or the settings, you can think of them as the parameters of the for loop. The benefit of the for loop is that all of the settings for it, or the instruction set in terms of how many times that's going to loop and such, the variable that we need to actually accomplish the looping, all of that is defined within these parentheses here, right? So for other loops, you might have to define the variable that keeps track of which iteration we are on, right? You might define this outside, but for the for loop, the nice thing is that you can actually define this inside. So we keep track of which lap we're on. You can think of it that way, or which iteration we're on, and that's going to start with 1, right? So we define this variable within the for loop. That means we can use it to keep track of where we're at within the loop. And then we're going to loop until I is less than the month entered, okay? So, and then the other thing that we need to do here is clarify what's going to happen to the I value after each loop, right? So we have 3 elements. We define that initial tracker variable. Then we define an end condition, so when that loop is going to stop. And then we specify how we're going to modify that value that we're using to keep track of the loop. Because if we don't specify this, I will never change unless we explicitly change it within the body of the for loop. So this is going to happen automatically because otherwise, if we did not increase I, it would stay at 1 and it would never reach that end condition and it would keep on looping forever. And we don't want a never-ending loop in this scenario. Okay, so next we go ahead and add days to the day count depending on which month we're looking at and whether or not it's, for example, a leap year. So if we have I representing a month that has 31 days, right? Then we go on and add 31 days, otherwise 28 days, otherwise 29 days, and lastly 30 days. And this all happens based on the if statements, essentially. So we have here the if statement and then 3 else ifs. So one of them is bound to happen, essentially. Okay, so we would look at January, for example. January would fall under those months with 31 days and add 31 to the day count. Then the following month, we would look at it and see if it's a leap year, because actually we have here, if I equals 2, then it really depends on whether or not it's divisible by 4 the year. And then we determine if it's a leap year. And if it's a leap year, we add 29 days. Otherwise, we add 28 days to the count so far. So as you can see, we are basically looping through the months of the year, right? And depending on the year that was entered, we're calculating if it's a leap year, we're calculating how many days per month, and we're translating those months into days because we're going to need that later for our calculation. So that's the first for loop. Don't worry too much if you know all the aspects of that didn't sit quite well right away. We have to look at some more examples and then it'll start to come into a clear picture for you. Okay, but just get the idea that we're basically repeating this code that is encapsulated within the body of the for loop. We're repeating this code as many times as we tell the program to. And how do we tell the program? Right here. Another note here about the modifier here. Once we've run through the body of the for loop once, this is when we have this incrementation, right? So this bit, you can think of it as being right below here, okay? Now, moving on. Next, we have to loop through the years and count how many leap years we have. So we created a variable to keep track of the count of the leap years. That's set to 0, of course, as a starting point. And then, as I mentioned to you, we have the for keyword. So we know we have a for loop here. We can think of them as the settings or the parameters of the for loop, right? The instruction set. And then we have the body of the for loop. So what's actually going to be repeated, okay? So for the year iterator, we're starting at 2001. So that's the limitation that we set on this program. Calculating the day of the week can get a bit tricky if you go past that, really, in terms of older dates. So to keep things nice and simple, we've set this limitation to 2001. So we're starting with 2001 and counting those leap years. And then notice how instead of calling this tracker variable I, so for example, in here, we had it named as I, and that in itself is something that you'll see quite often in programs. Programmers will often give the iterator variable a really simple name. You can always give it something a bit more meaningful. So in this case, we've named it the year iterator. So it would start at 2001. The loop will stop once the year iterator is goes above year. So if this condition is false, right, that's when the loop will stop. So as soon as it goes over the year. And then the next thing is the modifier. So the year iterator will increase by 1. This plus plus symbol, it basically takes the current value and then it adds 1, right? So after each iteration, this will happen, okay? So next we have the body of the for loop, and we just have an if statement. So it's quite simple. We look at the year iterator, its current value. So in the beginning, it would be 2001. Then we would see if there's a remainder or if it's divisible by 4, right? And if it's divisible by 4, we add a leap year to the leap year count. So you could write it like this. You could also do something a bit more simple. You could just do this, for example, and that would add 1. So just as we had it here for the iterator, for the leap year count, we could also do it this way. It would be exactly the same. But just to show you what's happening, I'm going to write it like this. It's a bit more visual, I suppose. So that's how we look at the for loops. And then we simply look at the year counts and we subtract the year 2000 minus 1 for the current one. Okay, so we get the number of years that have gone by so far. And then we have to calculate the total day count. So how many days in total since the year 2001. And for that, we basically have two variables to keep track of it. We have the total day count and then the resulting day number. And I'll show you how that comes into play in a moment. But we're basically adding up days in the current month, day count from previously elapsed days in the year, leap year count, and then the year count times 365. And that in total is going to give us the total day count. Don't worry too much about the formula itself. We're mainly focusing on those for loops. So don't worry if you don't understand the formula right away. That's not really the focus here, but just to tell you how we're getting to the end result. Okay. Also nice to know that this is a multi-line comment. Otherwise, you would have to go in and do something like this. So it's quite repetitive, and it's with something like this, it's nicer to do a multi-line comment. You start here and then you end here. So we're adding up our total day counts, and then we basically get the remainder when we divide by 7. And depending on that remainder, that's going to give us the day of the week. Okay. And for that, we're using a switch statement. So we enter the resulting day number, and then we translate that using the switch statement. So if it's 0, that's going to be Sunday. If it's 1, it's going to be Monday, and so on and so forth. And that's it for this program. If it helps, you can always go through it one more time, read through the comments. And as I mentioned, if you want to sit down with someone and actually take things at your own pace, if you have any questions, make sure to sign up for our private tutoring on the platform. But now let's try and see if that works, if our calculations all add up. So let's run that program. And let's try 11th of November of 2020. And that would be a Wednesday. And there you go. That's correct. You can try it on your own with different dates. Try experimenting with the code, playing with it. Something that you can do, it helps you visualize the loop. You can actually go in here and print out the value of I or of the tracker variable for the iteration. You can do something like this, so you're aware. And that way, every time it goes through and it prints out, you will get a reading of that value of I, so that you can understand how it's changing as the loop goes through. So in the very beginning, that's going to be 1, then it's going to be 2, then it's 3, until it reaches a point where it goes over the month, and then that gets canceled out. So that's the first loop, and it's quite handy to do this as well if you're not getting the result you expected and you want to do some troubleshooting to find out what's going on behind the scenes. So that's something that I would recommend. You can also play around with the initialization. So if you want to set this to 15 and see how that affects the outcome of your code. If you want to change the end condition, so if you want to do month plus 1, you will see that it ends up finishing 1 month later than entered. Okay. The other thing as well you can do here, so you can do I minus minus. So it's rather than incrementing the I variable, you can actually um, subtract one every time. That's something else that you can try on your own. And that's it for our first program looking at loops.